All right, hello everyone. My name is Josh Lynch, and today we're going to go over the substance of marble and plaster in Call of Duty Infinite Warfare. So the way I have the presentation set up is the first half is like PowerPoint with some notes on art direction, material thought processes, and then in the end we'll get into Substance Designer. So first of all, I want to say thanks to Infinity Ward for letting me discuss Call of Duty Infinite Warfare and the materials I made for the project. And for this session, we'll be discussing creating materials for COD IW, why and how Substance Designer was used, and material creation strategies. And then in the end, we're going to open up Substance Designer and do a breakdown of two materials. And then at the very end, I'll try to leave time for a wrap-up and Q&A, but if we run out of time, I'm available off to the side. I'll stick around. And so these are the two materials we're going to break down and check out how they were made. Okay, so some of the benefits of Substance Designer are for Call of Duty Infinite Warfare, we were able to create a wide variety of material types. And speed and usability, we could get rough ideas in-game very quickly. It's highly iterative and completely non-destructive, so if we needed to change something, it was not a problem. It's not like we had to resculpt anything. We could just go in and it was easy to do. So we were able to get great results with out-of-the-box nodes. And we had an unparalleled amount of reuse and sharing across multiple material types, so we were able to keep grunges really consistent or patterns in other types of materials. Consistency across multiple materials and levels. We also had a clean creation process where we had a clean height and normal map that was generated first, and that informed the rest of the material. And so the biggest thing to me is there's no more lack of noise control or fighting baked-in lighting information from photo source textures. And then the gloss and roughness creation is just fantastic in here. It's my favorite thing to do. And then the albedo is authored without any lighting information. So some of the basic art direction notes for Call of Duty Infinite Warfare were, we wanted a grounded world. So this meant no typical sci-fi tropes. Everything would have a push to feel realistic in its construction. And for map locations on Earth, there was a push to have old, current, and future elements mixed in. So you can see from this shot, it doesn't feel like in the future they just recreated everything. It looks like it does now or would 100 years ago, and some of the cars look different. So here's another shot, the same thing. Okay, so considerations when authoring materials. So when you're working on an FPS, right, like Call of Duty, the game is action-packed. You're running around. There's not a lot of action. It's not like a third-person narrative game where you're stopping and always looking around. So what that meant was a lot of the materials we made, we didn't put in a ton of detail because you're not going to see it very much, right? So why spend the time doing it? Yeah, there's not a lot of pausing and looking around. There were narrative moments that were exceptions to this rule, but it wasn't very often. So what does this mean? So we wanted to make materials that had clean reads that needed to be identifiable at a glance. So like if you look at this shot, there's plaster, there's cobblestone, and everything's just easily, like you can see it. And you can also look into the shot, nothing is very distracting. So we had detailed gloss. We paid a lot of attention to the gloss map and IRES. So we had simple albedos that were like mostly flat colors, and that's really what you want. Even in any other type of game, you don't want to have a really noisy albedo. And we wanted to have a focus on eye rest, right? So we wanted each shot, like if you were to just pause the camera, you could look into it and you could see it pretty easily, what was going on. Okay, so we made simple yet flexible materials. So the materials were fairly simple. There wasn't a lot of layering. That means we didn't pack in a lot of, like for a ground texture, we didn't pack in a lot of debris. This meant they could be used in a variety of levels and scenarios. And they were often used with decals and blends later to add detail. So like this shot here, this asphalt is a blended material. And we wanted to be able to maximize potential. So it is advantageous to try to build textures that could have multiple purposes and use cases. And we wanted to have the ability to use on the floor, wall, ceiling when appropriate. Obviously you wouldn't use asphalt on a ceiling, but I think you know what I mean. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how it worked when I got a task, and then how it went to creating the final pass. So the first thing that happens is there's some reference gathering, right? Like sometimes your lead will oftentimes already have reference or they task you to gather it. And my tip is to just gather as much reference as you can because you never know where the ideas are going to come from. And then you want to create a plan of attack based on the gathered reference and your discussion with your lead. And then we tested in game. So working in vacuum is not ideal. I can't stress this enough that you want to get the earliest iteration of the material into the game as soon as possible. You don't want to just take it all the way to finish and then find out it doesn't work. All right, and then communication, you want to talk with your other artists and be open to feedback and iteration. So oftentimes when you're working on something, you might have like, you think the best idea and then somebody else is going to come up with something and you want to be able to react to that. All right, so inspiration from real world reference. So a lot of time is spent looking at real world and military reference when creating art for the Call of Duty universe. Creating materials is no exception. Every material made is based on or inspired by real life reference, and each material is grounded in physically accurate material properties. So oftentimes when I'm looking at reference, I'm trying to break it down, and I get asked this question a lot, so I wanted to talk a little bit about how I do it. So the first thing I look at is the macro to micro. So I try to identify the details of all sizes, right? So as far as the height and normal in this shot, I'm noticing that there's a square pattern, there's subtle tilt or ramp per tile. So you can see that the light, like, yeah, you can see my cursor. The light here doesn't follow perfectly straight, and you notice that this tile is catching the light more than the before around it. There's some subtle edge damage, and there's small surface noise and pitting, like you can see it in this tile in particular. And then the gloss and the roughness. The surface is very smooth with interest coming from age scuffs and dirt collecting. And then crevices and pitting show the breakup of light. And as far as the albedo goes, there's large blocks of color, variation from strands and secondary noise. Okay, so moving on to material creation strategies. This is what I think about when I'm working on a height or a normal map. I create it first. So these maps are the foundation of any material. And like most things, a strong foundation is key. So without these maps, the albedo and gloss or roughness are not going to shine. And don't make the normal map too intense. Everything will look dark and self-shadowed, so I'll go over that later. And as far as the roughness, so just to give it like a broad overview, the gloss or the roughness is going to control the response of the light. Smooth surfaces have tight highlights and reflect the world around it. Matte surfaces have a broad highlight and little reflection of the world around it. And it's a good idea to establish basic material separation and properties early on to start to give the material some life. So even if it's not, like I mentioned, getting things into game early and often, so even if it's not a final pass, just to give it like a feeling of, hey, this is a really smooth floor, it's really shiny, it's brand new, or it's old, just to give the feeling early on is really ideal. And then a lot of time should be spent on the gloss and roughness map. So to quantify it, I would say like at least, I spend probably half the time on it. I think it's, like in this next bullet point, it says depending on the surface type, I feel like it's arguably as important, if not more important than the normal map. Because when you're rolling the light across the surface, the gloss or the roughness is going to give the feeling of how old it is, or how new, or how worn, or what type of surface it is. Like, does it feel like concrete or plastic? All right, so as far as the albedo goes, I feel like simple albedos provide the best results. Using simple colors as a base is ideal. You want to keep colors in line with your reference material. Don't bake lighting information into the albedo. I can't stress that enough. If it ever feels like your albedo is awkward, that's a good thing. You don't want to just pipe in AO or edge highlights. You want it to feel pretty simple, and you want to trust the shader and the lighting to do their job. Quality albedos can take time to create in Substance Designer. There is no one node to make your albedo look great. And for me, when I first started learning Substance Designer, I tried to apply the Photoshop workflows that I was using, so like adjustment layers with masks or groups with masks or anything like that. That's how I approach Substance Designer, so I treat each blend node kind of like that as I'm stepping along the chain. And for me, effective layering and decision making helps to create believability and improve overall quality. And using masks generated from your curvature map or AO maps will help to create believable details. And then as far as the AO goes, ambient occlusion maps are essential for selling depth in a material, typically added as an additional map or packed into channel. I know that not everybody's game engine has the option to have an AO map, so if you ever don't have that, I would recommend taking the AO map and maybe making a mask out of it by inverting this and just putting in dust or dirt. And that way you aren't actually baking lighting info into the albedo, but you're giving a sense of depth via like natural dust or dirt collecting. Okay, so key ways to make surfaces feel alive. So I talked a little bit about it in the breakdown of the reference, but to me bending the light is a huge deal. So you add a slope to the normal map and it will make the surface feel more organic by bending the light. So if you look at this tile here, right, like the highlight does not just continue straight down, there's a subtle shift into the next panel. And then the fingernail test. So I like to think of it like, how does it look like it would feel if you scrape your fingernail across the surface? Is it like smooth plastic? Is it rough concrete? You want that feeling in your normal map to come through. And then as far as the tail of the light, so I mentioned this a couple times already, but treating the gloss with good amount of attention brings interest when the light hits the surface. So every light has like a hot spot, right? And then as it fades off, that's like the tail of the light. And the more interest you have in your glossy or roughness map, as that light is fading off, it's gonna bring interest, right? So you wanna have something in there that makes it feel like if you wanna have a really weathered surface, you're going to want to have a lot of information in your gloss. Like you can see there's a lot of variation in here from gray to light to dark. And then as far as the albedos go, you want to keep eye rest when the light is not hitting the surface. So you want really simple albedos with flat colors. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get into Substance Designer now. Thanks for taking the time, and I hope that the PowerPoint was informative. We're going to go into material breakdowns of the marble and the plaster, and yeah. So as far as the marble goes, the first thing I did when I was working on this was I wanted to create the strands first, right? So you see, let me turn this off here. Whatever. Can't find it. So when I made I wanted to make the strands first, right? So typically what I do is I take like any of these available noises and I just start to skew them around. So I take this clouds, I have like a transform 2D where I'm just skewing it way up, and then I use a make it tile photo grayscale node to bring the tiling back. And then I'm a big fan of using like a directional warp to get this kind of wavy pattern here. And then I'll use a transform 2D again to skew it. And then I do a histogram scan, and then I make it tile again. So I'm not afraid to take existing data and move it around and then make it tile again. So I do the same thing through here. So I get this type of detail, I skew it, and I make it tile. And then I use a blend to bring them together. So if you notice, a lot of this stuff, I put it at diagonals. I found that just over time, if you have any kind of tiling texture, if you put it at a diagonal and you're walking across it, it doesn't feel so directional. It just kind of feels like there's interest, but you're not going like straight and back or left to right. So I think that's pretty important. So again, I just have these types of setups where I have clouds running through a couple of times with directional warps. I skew it, and I run through and make it tile. And then I use the levels to clamp the data down. And so the other thing I do is I take this type of data here and I run it through a gradient map. And I just use these keys to put in some simple colors, right? So I don't want too much contrast here at this point. I'm just trying to make my early base strands, right? So that's like a blend with an add sub at a super low value, like a 0.1. And then my base color value is pretty low at 60. Okay. So as far as these spots go, like I noticed in some of my other reference, there was some like tiny secondary noise spots. So I just went ahead and put those in. And then I did some more strands here. So these are more of like what you think of when you think of marble, like they're the typical, like sinewy kind of looking like strands. So the way I made those is I have a cells, and I run it through an edge detect. There's all sorts of different ways to get to this point. This is just how I did this at the time. So I have a directional warp, and I'm feeding that through a clouds, right? So my directional warp is at a kind of high intensity of 50. But the thing that I'm trying to get here is I'm trying to take this straight geometric looking line, and I'm trying to move it around a bit and make it feel more organic. And yeah, so I do this a few times. So I'm just trying to get something that's like it's pulling the strands apart and moving them around. And then most of the marble reference I saw, it has like a strong line and then like a soft fade off. So I use a slope blur to capture that detail. And then this is the same kind of setup, right, where I'm taking this cells, taking the strands and I'm moving them around, but I do it at different degrees. I finish off with the same slope blur setup, and then I combine it. So the thing that's important to me is when I'm doing this, if I'm ever combining data like this, I want to plug in one of these example like kind of grunge maps that are available. So if I were to delete this, you can see that the read it just becomes very, like it's very samey. Like I love when you plug in like a grunge and it breaks it up. And then I invert that, I plug that into a gradient map, and then I just do a screen here. So I'm just trying to bring in those strands, but I'm not trying to make it like too contrasty in here. Like everything's pretty, like it's brighter, but it's not too intense. And this is another setup of strands. I don't want to go into this too much, but it is a tile sampler with the levels, and then I use a distance to get that spread out. And then I use a directional warp. And then I do an edge detect here. So one thing that I do is I mentioned I have usually like a grunge map plugged into the blends. And I'll take an edge detect here, and this one is set to 1. This one's set to 1.5. And then I run it through a blend, so I'm able to get some strands that feel really thick and some that are thinner. And then I'll do the same thing where I take a directional warp and I start to modulate it around. And then I do the slope blur thing. And then I did black and white spots here just to break it up. So I have two sets of strands coming together. So these are my like kind of thicker and stronger looking strands. Okay, so that's how I built up the strands. The other thing that I wanted to achieve when I was working on this file was I wanted to be able to have tiling marble, and then I wanted to have a pattern of marble, right? So like a tiling texture of just marble. So when we were working on the map for this, that this marble is in, we needed something that had square tiles, but we also needed something tiling that could cover a large space. And for me, I didn't want to have multiple files, right? So I wanted to have everything contained in one file. I wanted to leverage this data that I had just created. So what I found was I was able to use this multi-switch setup, and I exposed some parameters here. So if I come in here and I turn the pattern off, you can see that the squares go away and it's just the tiling marble. And then if I were to turn it back on, you can see that the squares come in. And then I also have a color picker. So I have a black, and then I have white. So it's all set up in these multi-switch nodes. So I don't know if you guys have ever seen them, but let me just make one real quick. So if I have a multi-switch, by default, this is kind of what you get. So if I were to come in here and just expose this parameter, and I'm going to call it new, and I'm going to say GDC test, okay. And I'm going to double click the graph to get down in here into my input parameters. So there's all these options, right? Like you can set a Boolean, an integer, a float, or a slider. But I like to use a drop-down list. So I'm able to come in here and put in a value and give this a name. So I can say test01, right? And I can add an item. And I can give it another value. And I can say test02. So what this is going to allow us to do is if I just grab a noise here, you can see what's going on. I grab the cells, and then I do like a fractal sum. So I have this double clicked so we can see what's going on with its output. And if I come up here and I say test02, it's going to grab the bottom. So if you guys have any questions about that at the end, just let me know, but I just wanted to give a quick run through there. So as far as getting the square pattern to work, I'm going to go ahead and clear that out. Switch this back to pattern being on. So it's pretty straightforward to get this set up. What I have here is large square. So I have a multi-value grayscale map, and then I have my gradient ramp tilts. And like I just typically whenever I have something like this, like the gradation, I want them to all be kind of tilting away from each other. So I mess with the pattern rotation random or the symmetry random. So you can see that different amounts give you different outputs here. So I just kind of settled on that. And then I have a smaller square setup. It's the same principle, right? So this is the part where I combine the multi-value grayscale maps. And I do that by clamping this data down to white. And I run that into the blend of the opacity so I have a mask. So this is my multi-value grayscale large squares and then the smaller ones. So if you notice, each of these values are different than the next. So what that means is I can come in here and leverage the edge detect to get some initial separation. And then I come in here and I have different bevel setups. So some are thicker and some are tighter bevels. And I just run this multi-value grayscale map into it to get variation, right? So it's not all this uniform line weight. So like every step of the way, I'm trying to add anything that I can to break up the line weight or the way anything is being generated to make it feel more organic. And then in here I have like a slight inward bevel just to give it like a bit more of a slope into the fine line right there. And then I blur it. And then I just kind of run through here. Right? And I do a multiply. So there's something I want to point out here between doing a multiply and a subtract. So if I do, let me see here, or not a multiply and a subtract, sorry, multiply and a min darken. So what I ended up using was a min darken to get this kind of edge chipping. And the way I set up the edge chipping is I just have black and white spots. I scaled up the via transform, did a histogram scan, and then I ran it through a directional warp. So I'm isolating it per tile. And then I run it through a slope blur. So what this gives me is if I turn off this directional warp, you can see that you get areas like this, and you may want that, right? Like you may be making something where you have like a contact point, like a crack, and you want this around that specific contact point, the damage to happen. But for me, I didn't want that. I wanted chipping to happen on each tile, and I'm trying to make it feel like if I were sculpting these, I would not make one tile have the same treatment next to the tile next to it. So what I do is I use this directional warp, and that kind of shifts the data around so I get isolated chipping, right? So something's happening here, but not right next to it on the other tile. And I use a min darken. And so the reason that I use a min darken versus a multiply is, if you see here, like if you watch my my line here, when the data coming in before it is one value of gray, and then I add my chips and that doesn't shift, right? But if I do a multiply, it affects this line in between the tiles. So I don't want to be working and going along and take something that I've worked out before and then affect it. I want to just add on top of it cleanly without affecting what's there. And then I take this data and I do an add sub onto the, like a flat gray. And I always work flat gray because I think of it like a height map or like a plane in ZBrush. If I'm going up, I'm going to white. If I'm going down, I'm going to black. And I just always start at mid gray. And I don't have much depth in here because tile flooring isn't super thick, right? Like you don't want this crazy height map. So as far as the tilts go, I just combine them the same way. I have this mask. I combine the two gradation setups. And then I do an add sub because I want some of the tile, like some corners of the tile to raise up as much as I want it to go down on the other side. And I inverted the grayscale of this multi-value grayscale map here because I wanted all the larger tiles to be affected equally, but the smaller ones I didn't want them to get as much of the add sub because I felt like that was making it look a little too busy. So if you see here, let me get this. As soon as I take this add sub out with this gradation, it looks like super planar, and it doesn't look very like old and lived in. So as soon as I add that tilt, you can see it starts to fracture the light as it rolls across, and it just starts to make it feel more interesting. And then as far as the surface damage, it's just really tiny pocks. And then you can't even barely see them in here. So like that's how they show up in the normal map. And I mentioned in my PowerPoint not having your normal map be too intense. So if I take this up to like 50, it just looks like that ZBrush matte cap that you're not supposed to use. So you don't want to do that. You want to have it feel a little bit more natural. And for the purposes of this presentation, I use the new HB AO node because it's awesome. But previously I would have to do like a bunch of curvature setups and mask, and I'd combine it to make my AO, but this is a lot more natural looking, so I just plug that in. And then as far as the color goes, the only thing I did after I made these strands is I just added a simple amount of dust just to make it feel a little bit like it's settled in a room. And as far as the gloss goes, so let me go ahead and take my color to gray so we can just look at it like that. So most marble floors are very, like, if you're standing on top of them, you can see them reflecting the world around it. And we were using a gloss setup, so I have a uniform color and I have it pretty much near white. And then I just introduce a subtle amount of smudging and build up here. And then I add some scratches. And I use a crescent for this. I do a warp, I blur it subtly, and then I break it up with a grunge. So I get that. Do another pass of scratches. And then I call this crunchy grunge, but it's basically something that I didn't want it to feel like smudges or oils. I wanted it to feel like really like it's starting to wear on the varnish. So I have like a black and white spots. I clamp it down just a bit. And then I love using the directional warp for this stuff. So I have this noise, I run this grunge map through it, and then I get this. So I'm able to get like per pixel changes as well as this smudgy bits. and then I use a grunge to subtract, and then I make it punchy through here. So I have this, and then I do a histogram scan, and then I take this white data and I punch it up. And then I set that to a subtract. So as you're, let me see, so if I take this and I set this subtract up, you can see that it starts to really feel worn. And then I just have the, like in the multi-switch setup, I have it set up to be like a pattern on-off. So that's what this is doing. And then this is my edge roughness here. And then my like dust buildup. Okay, so we're running a little low on time, so I'm just going to go ahead and jump into the plaster. Okay, so as far as the plaster goes, now this is pretty straightforward. There's nothing really fancy here in terms of setups. So we didn't want like there's all types of plasters, right, in the world and that we had in the game, but for this one in particular, we wanted something rough looking. So the way I set it up was I just have this grunge map, I blur it, I run it through a levels to modulate the data, and that's my base. And then I have this clouds, I invert it, I have a gradient map here, and then I run it through a copy. So what I'm trying to do here is I'm just trying to take advantage of existing data, use whatever I can to flip it around on itself and get creative. And then I use that, run through a blend at a max lighten. So what that's going to do is wherever there's darker data, it's going to allow me to have this stuff show up. So if you notice, let me find a good spot here, where it's fairly bright already, this data is not coming through. So let me make a better example real quick. So if I have this fractal sum and I do this, where'd it go? All right. So if you see where there's a lot of darker or black data, when you run a max lighten, the data that's running through the top of the blend is going to come through there, but not at the peaks of the white spots. So I hope that makes sense. If you have any other questions after, just let me know. And I just keep using these noises that are available, and I use it as an overlay to modulate the height map. And I do that a few more times, and that's pretty much where I ended up with the height map. So again, I talked about having it be closer to middle gray. So I take a range, like a histogram range, and what that's going to do is, instead of taking like a levels, okay, something like this, and I take a levels and I bring the black up and the white triangle down, and I'm having to drag like two things, and it's a lot of maintenance. With the histogram range, if I just have it at 1 and I take it down to 0.5, I'm essentially dragging both of those triangles in via just one slider. So I take it down to 0.35, and this is where the normal map ended up. So again, we just wanted something that felt rough and kind of unfinished, and that's how I got the normal and height map there. And as far as the gloss goes, it was pretty low, like middle gray. And then I leverage these curvature nodes as I mentioned before, and I combine them via an add sub in the blend here, use the levels, and then I just make that my mask, right? And I'm saying multiply here because I want to make it feel like in the gloss that dust and dirt are collecting in the crevices. And then I have an additional mask where I call out the peaks, so I make them just a bit shiny. just because it calls attention to it, and I felt like it sold the surface better. And then I'm taking this grunge map, and I'm actually feeding the height map through it to power it. So I'm kind of trying to have the height map affect the directionality of it, as far as like where these warps are happening. And then I do an overlay here to give just a bit more interest. And so this is something I wanted to make sure to cover with you guys, is leveraging your normal map to make it feel like dust is naturally collecting. So like if you think of this as like a top down, right? And it's on a wall, and over time dust is going to collect on the tops of things. So I take my normal map, I do an RGBA split node, and I take the green channel and I clamp that down. Right, so I'm only affecting the tops of like the normal and the height map of the plaster, and I'm saying, hey, I want those to feel more matte because that's where the dust is collecting. And then I have an AO mask here, and again, I'm just trying to, like I mentioned before, leverage the existing height and normal map data to make a more believable gloss and albedo pass. And then as far as the albedo goes, it's pretty straightforward. It's like one color, and then I have the mask for my crevices. I put some dirt in there, just real subtle. This is where I'm leveraging that upward mask, so that's my dirt collecting there, and that's pretty much it. And then the AO, like I mentioned, I'm using the new awesome HB AO node, and that's kind of the basis for making plaster. Does anybody have any questions? Okay, cool. Thanks a lot for your time.